Somebody say something? Okay, I'm assuming my audio is good. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Hope you guys are excited. I'm certainly excited by this session. My name is William Lam. I'm part of the Solution Architecture team as part of the VMware Cloud Foundation division. And I'm actually joined by two of my colleagues today, Shri Daz and Jared Burns. They're going to be assisting me on this webinar and helping answer any questions that you may have. So let's make this interactive. Go ahead and blast your questions away as we kind of go through. So today we're going to talk about some of the new deployment strategies as it pertains to the new VCF 9.0 architecture. Here's a quick look at the agenda. We're going to cover some of the new concepts and the constructs that's introduced in VCF 9.0. Some of these things might be familiar to you, but there's certainly a lot of new things to keep in consideration in terms of how you might design and architect your solution. Next, we're going to take a look at the different ways in which you can design and really deploy a VCF 9 deployment, and we'll go through some of the most common design options that we've been working through. And then we'll switch gears and kind of show you how to get to VCF 9 from where you're currently at today, whether you're an existing vSphere customer, or perhaps you got a combination of vSphere and some other component, or you're an existing VCF customers. And then we're going to include with some takeaways to think about how you wanted to start to think about designing and architecting your VCF 9 deployment. So first off, we're going to take a look at some of the concepts. Now, I think it's important before we kind of get started, it's just a level set a little bit around what does VCF 9 deliver in terms of a modern private cloud experience, and how does this really connect back to some of the components that you're going to be thinking about as an architect, as a practitioner. As you know, many of you customers, such as yourself, you have infrastructure running in many different places, many of you in your own on-prem secure private data centers, but we also have a lot of customers who run this in some trusted partner infrastructure, cloud service providers, and even all the way out the edge. You want to be able to have a unified way of managing this infrastructure. And ultimately, that is what VCF 9 delivers, right? The substrate that becomes this consistent infrastructure that you as a practitioner, whether it's an enterprise admin, service provider admin, now is able to take this software stack and really start to unify and provide this unified way of centrally managing your infrastructure, whether it's capacity management, multi-tenancy, configuration drift, identity access management, and certainly all the fleet level capabilities across the stack. So now you have visibility across. And ultimately, you want to be able to consume this using the interfaces of your choice, whether it's a graphical interface, whether it's automation through APIs, CLI, and even some modern desired state infrastructure. And typically, this is what we refer to as building and operating your private cloud. Now, once you've got that private cloud construct, how do we then take that and start to slice that up in different set of resources that I can then allocate to the different lines of businesses and maybe even smaller customers if I'm a service provider? And typically, this role is done by a line of business admin, tenant admin, and of course, it could be somebody such as yourself that's also being taking that responsibility. And how do I do that from a unified standpoint, right? And again, using VCF 9, we're then now able to centrally manage not only governance, role-based access control, but also the different policies, application, service catalogs that is then available to your end users. And that's the most important part about this infrastructure, right? Is to really serve the different applications and the different set of personas that might come and consume your private cloud experience, right? This can be your typical end user in an IT organization where they just need access to productivity tools. It can be a developer who's writing code natively within their IDE, and they're able to push those changes so that automatically infrastructure is delivering on the needs of the business. Or it's a platform engineering team that's developing the next hottest application. What that allows us to do is then take this raw infrastructure that is then sliced up, role-based access control, and ultimately allows them to deploy and create both traditional workloads as well as modern workloads, whether it's Kubernetes, AI, and ML. And the rest is really doing it in their native and a modern consumption interface. And this is what we think about as consuming the private cloud. Now, the reason I put this slide up there is really help you start to connect the dots in terms of some of the roles, functionality, and ultimately that private cloud experience. If you look at the lower bottom of the half, this is really where VCF operation comes into play. And it's not the old VCF operations or RE operations that you may know it. It is a completely brand new implementation. And I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the considerations to be aware of. And from a consumption standpoint, this is ultimately our VCF automation stack, right? And so just keep this in mind as we kind of go through the different design and architectural best practices. Like I mentioned earlier, VCF plays a very critical role in VCF 9. Today, many of you already have this deployed, and today you're currently using it for things like diagnostics, troubleshooting, capacity planning, and central monitoring. And VCF operation continues to deliver on those key capabilities But in VCF 9, it takes on a much more critical role in your infrastructure. Again, it provides you with that global control plane, single place to be able to have visibility, management, and configuration of your entire infrastructure. And with this new fleet level capability, not only will you get benefits of lifecycle management, such as patch and upgrade to make sure that you're on the latest version of software stack to be able to address security and compliance, but now you have net new capabilities that is at your disposal just simply by upgrading to VCF 9. First and foremost, you'll now have true single sign-on across the entire stack. I'm sure you've heard about that earlier in the day today, but you also have capabilities of consistent policies for certificate management, passwords, and even unified tagging in one central location that can then flow down into your infrastructure. And because of this unified control plane and the fleet level visibility that you have, it makes a lot of sense to also simplify another aspect that we don't always like to talk about, licensing, right? And in VCF 9, we move away from traditional licensing to more of a stateless sort of keyless entitlement. So rather than having to figure out which license keys are entitled where, you have a pool of entitlements that gets configured, and automatically an infrastructure is able to basically pull and see which infrastructure needs which set of licenses and automatically divvies that out. So it really simplifies your overall management of your assets. And then of course, we continue to support things like capacity management, monitoring, and certainly modern security operations and compliance. And I'm sure you'll learn a lot about that, if not earlier, also later in the day. But again, just keep in mind that VCF operation plays a very critical role in VCF 9.0. And these are just some of the key aspects that are available as you think about designing and architecting your solution. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the different concepts, and here's just to give you just a high-level overview summary of the hierarchy as we think about these different components. Some of these things might sound familiar. Some of these might be completely brand new. We're going to kind of step through each of these, starting kind of from the most bottom and slowly go all the way up to the higher top. So we start off with something called a VCF domain, a VCF instance, a VCF fleet, and then at the end of the day, we have this full thing called a VCF private cloud. So we start off with our core building blocks, as many of you have already known, right? Our compute, our storage, and our networking constructs. Obviously, compute is our vSphere platform that has vCenter and ESXi hosts, right? It manages a collection of these clusters. Now, on the storage front, if you look at previous version of VCF, we had some limitations in terms of what optionality we were able to provide. With VCF 9, you now have a lot more options. In addition to vSAN as your primary storage option, you also have the ability to specify fiber channel VMFS storage or external NFS storage. So you certainly have a lot more options now than you did before. Now, certainly vSAN comes out of the box in terms of entitlement for VCF. And so you can take advantage of vSAN, especially the net new architecture with ESA. And there's a lot of great features and capabilities that come with that. But you do have choice from a storage standpoint. Obviously, for networking is going to be our NSX solution. And this core set of building blocks or software-defined construct is what we call a VCF domain. Now, we can have different types of VCF domain. One type of VCF domain is what we call a VCF management domain. And there are some new items that are included in this component. Here we have this new VCF operations collector. This is really a unified collector. So if you're familiar with the RA operations collector, we've also unified a lot of that collection, metrics, inventory, logging into one centralized component called the VCF operations collector. And this helps us inventory these different components and ultimately feed that into our local control plane, which is SVC manager. And this allows us to lifecycle, manage, operate these infrastructure in a bubble. Now, obviously, you can run both our VCF management components, but you can also run workloads. So for customers who have a smaller environment that don't need a whole set of dedicated resources, and you can continue using things like vSphere resource pools to segment and isolate your workloads, I can run both management components as well as my workloads component. Now, for some of our larger customers who may want to have segmentation, maybe different types of workload policies, profiles, maybe there's licensing constructs that I need to worry about, they can also deploy a different type of VCF domain, which is referred to as a VCF workload domain. And in this example here, you see we have our core compute, storage, and networking. And what you don't see in this deployment is an additional collector and additional SCDC manager. And what that means is that using a single VCF managed domain, I can now centrally manage, lifecycle, and operate not only my management components, but also additional workload domains, right? So one single component can manage that. And think of this as sort of your local control plane here. And I can, of course, deploy additional VCF workload domains. And when I have a single VCF workload domain, and potentially one or more one VCF management domain, and I may or may not have additional workload domain. This is what we call a VCF instance, sort of an instantiation of our deployment stack. And of course, we talked about earlier the importance of VCF operations. So when we take this VCF instance and now we overlay this additional component of VCF operations, as well as our VCF automation component, and this is a one-to-one, we now have something we'll refer to as a VCF fleet. And the reason for this is that when you look at VCF operations and automation, these are really our fleet-wide services. It's able to manage multiple of these workload domains, and in fact, multiple of these VCF instances, and it provides you really that global control plane that then orchestrates these local control planes for each of these instances. So in this example here, I have one single fleet that's comprised of one VCF instance that has a management domain and two workload domains. Now, a fleet can also comprise of multiple VCF instances. So in this example here, you can see I still have my single VCF operations, single VCF automation, but now I have additional VCF instances that I can also manage. And this is what we refer to as a fleet. So it can contain one instance or many instances all collectively together. Now, obviously, the next one up is if I have multiple VCF fleets, this is what we refer to as a VCF private cloud. Each of the fleet has its own standalone VCF automation and operations. So just to quickly summarize here, from a logical view standpoint, a VCF instance is comprised of a VCF management domain, can also include a workload domain. And when I have a collection of these VCF instances, along with one VCF operations and one VCF automation, this is what we refer to as a VCF fleet. And this is what you see when you go through the VCF installer for the very first time to go and deploy your VCF 9 infrastructure. And then again, another logical view from a VCF private cloud standpoint, when I have a collection of these VCF fleets operating independent of each other, this together is what we refer to as a VCF private cloud. So hopefully that was nice and clear and sets the right terminology and baseline. Now, before we kind of go jump into the design, I do want to cover some additional terminology that we'll be talking about around availability zone, right? Which is really a fault domain construct that allows us to really set this fault domain at a VCF instance level. When you look at the diagram to your right, you can see in the VCF instance one is actually its resources are spread across two different availability zones, right? This can be different racks, chassis, rooms, could even be potentially data center, but typically this is low latency, high connectivity between these instances. And then we also have a concept of a region. Typically, this is geographically separated. So if you look at VCF instance 2, it resides in a single availability zone, but it is located in a different region. And again, here we can have a single instantiation of VCF operation and automation managing these two different instances that are deployed with different sets of availability purposes. And we'll kind of dive that in a little bit. Okay, let's now take a look at some of the design options that's available with VCF 9. And a big part of it, when you think about these different designs that we'll talk about, it's really around the levels of availability that you're providing, not only for the VCF management components, but also ultimately for your workload domains. We have local fault protection. Today, when you deploy VCF, you have the ability to specify something called simple or basic mode or high availability mode. So for example, when I deploy something like NSX Manager today, I actually have the ability to specify it in a singleton model. So it's a single appliance. Whereas if you look at with VCF 5.x, my only option was a 3-node configuration. And for environments that require higher levels of availability, I can specify the HA model, and now I'll get 3 nodes for NSX. We talked about protecting across availability zones already, right? Things like power outages, network fabrics will protect against that. And then ultimately thinking about it from a disaster recovery standpoint, right? So these are the different fault domains that you kind of were keep in consideration when you think about the different designs that we'll talk about in a second. The first design is what we call sort of the basic design. And as that it sounds, right? It's most basic, most fundamental. This is still the full VCF 9 stack. You have a management domain, and you can also include a workload domain, and it does include both VCF automation and automation, and it's designed to run in a single availability zone and a single region. Now, while it runs within a single AZ and region, you can still have local availability. As I mentioned earlier, these appliances such as NSX Manager, VCF automation operation, I can go from single node, or I can deploy that in a 3-node configuration for availability. But this design becomes sort of that building block. Think of it as like a Lego piece that can then be used to construct other more complex designs, right? But it all stems from this primary building block here. The second design is our VCF with site high availability. So this is across the different availability zones. And again, this really provides additional fault domains where you might have, say, power outages, network fabrics, different data centers, maybe even a room, and allows us to take these different management components as well as workload components, as you can see here, and actually distribute them across two different availability zones. Now, obviously, there's some technical dependencies here around networking and storage. And for our implementation, we're relying on our vSAN stretch technology. You do have the option to specify other types of non-vSAN storage. And of course, you want to have similar requirements to kind of meet the latency and the different types of requirements there to satisfy the ability to have storage that's going to be able to run across two different availability zones. So this is our VCF with site availability. The next one is our VCF with disaster recovery. So I've got a primary instance, could be in single AZ, single region, and now I'm able to replicate that and to be able to ensure that I have a business continuity or even disaster avoidance to my secondary region that has my full VCF stack, right? Pretty straightforward here. Again, I want to be able to fail over and fail back potentially to protect all of the different components, and these are kind of operating in two different regions. And then the fourth design is really taking the combination of design 2 and 3 and really creating this sort of hybrid scenario where we now have protection against higher levels of availability using multiple AZs within a region as well as across regions. So this is a combination of using multiple availability zones as well as multiple regions with replication, right? So again, you kind of see this building block aspect of it. So just to quickly summarize, we have 4 different common design deployments for VCF.9. We've got our basic design, which is really that building block. It allows you to start small, which was not the case in previous releases of VCF. I can then grow and expand based on the levels of availability. And the nice thing about VCF9, unlike prior versions, is it's very flexible in how I design my management constructs, how I deploy my workload constructs, and best of all, I can actually mix and match based on the technical requirements and business requirements of your organization, right? So these are the 4. Now, I know that we quickly just went through this at a high level. There's certainly a lot more content, especially from our team that we built. And something that I want to make you aware of are these new design blueprints. Now, for some of you who've worked with VCF in the past or looked at design and architecture documentation, sometimes it's a PDF on the side of the website. Sometimes it's really hard to find. One of the things that we did was bring in all this design and architecture content directly into the Broadcom documentation site. So here's a screenshot of the VCF9 documentation. And you can see from the very top, right after release notes, overview, you're straight into the design. So we want to make sure it's very easy for you to find. And in this design section, there are 3 subsections. First one, think of this as sort of informational. Some of the things that we had talked about earlier, some of the constructs, some of the different components, all the details, different implications, educational materials. So think of this kind of like a learning perspective. So I kind of understand all the different pieces that plays into what could look like from a design standpoint. And then the meat of the design document is really something what we're calling these new design blueprints. And today there's 5, and in the future we may have more blueprints, but these are kind of the most common ones. We've talked to a lot of customers, look at the existing deployments, look at the different availability models that they're looking at, and the business needs that they need to address. And we've kind of come up with these 5. The first one is really the single fleet deployment, right? Using minimal footprint, right? So it allows you to quickly get started, run this into production. And as you start to understand the capabilities of VCF, now you can quickly grow into an HA configuration. And then we have the other 4 design, which are the ones that we had just talked about. And for each of these design, they do build up from these different items within what we call a design library. So for each of these designs, there'll be specific design capabilities that we're using. And so this is sort of a little bit of the back end. But if you want to kind of drill down and understand, where are these design questions, what are some of the considerations, and what are some of the choices that you have that you can make? What are some of the recommendations that we recommend based on the things that we see in terms of having a scalable and performance solution? But there are some choices that you do have. So take a look at the content. And if you have any feedback, definitely let us know. There is a way to leave feedback in the documentation, and that does make it back to the authors and team. So that's a little bit around the design blueprints to really help you understand all the different caveats, consideration, and how best to ultimately deploy your private cloud solution. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We talked a little about the different constructs that make up VCF9. We talked about some of the design options that are available to you. But now let's get right into it. Sort of like, how do I get you to VCF9? And really starting from where you're at today. And these are something that we're calling pathways. And today there's sort of three key pathways that we tend to talk about. First one is around greenfield deployment. Now, it's not, when I say greenfield, I don't mean complete brand new data center. I don't have any infrastructure on. Now, while we do have customers that do that still, most customers typically will have some existing infrastructure. Sometimes it's aging infrastructure, hardware is not as new, and they want to deploy a modern private cloud, modern hardware so they can get the full benefits of VCF9. And so they'll deploy a brand new greenfield VCF9 infrastructure, and then they'll have this running side by side with their existing infrastructure. And then I'm going to use technologies like VMware HCX to then move those workloads in this brand new infrastructure. So that's really what I mean by greenfield deployment. The second pathway is around upgrading from your existing vSphere environment. Many of you today are running vSphere and a combination of the different products, especially with vSphere and operations. And you already know that operations is a key aspect of VCF9. And we'll talk about some explicit scenarios in terms of how do you upgrade from the existing components that you've got. And then the last pathway is obviously for customers who are already existing VCF customers. And how do we get you from the existing version that you've got all the way directly to VCF9? So we're going to talk about the greenfield deployment first. So first and foremost, it's extremely important across these different deployment models to really design and really just plan accordingly, making sure that you've got sufficient IP addresses, you understand the minimum resource requirements, the minimum set of IPs, DNS, and then also making sure that those DNS entries work, because we all know that sometimes it's either NTP or DNS. And so making sure that all those parameters are well suited. And we do have a planning and preparation document that you can follow. And based on the design that you're looking at, based on what you're trying to deploy, it will provide you with the set of inputs and really just allows you to better prepare so that when you actually go through the installer and the actual deployment, it goes extremely smoothly. And then obviously you want to prepare your ESXi host using latest 9.0 version. And once you've got that, you're now going to deploy this thing called a VCF installer. Now, for those of you who've experienced VCF in the past, this is going to replace the Cloud Builder appliance. It used to be this monolithic appliance that you would download for every single version. It will contain all the binaries. We've simplified that with this new VCF installer that allows you to only download just the installer and then connect it to a software depot. Speaking of software depot, that's the next step. You do have two ways of pulling down the binaries from Broadcom. First one is online connected. You go ahead and generate your download token and you put that into the installer and it automatically connects it back to broadcom.com and pulls down all the required binaries to start your deployment. That's only one way of starting the deployment. But many customers also have air gap environments. They might want to set up an offline depot that serves as a distribution for other environments within behind their firewall. So you can set up something called an offline depot, and that allows you to take this new utility called the VCF download tool. It works just like the UI. You plug in your download token, it automatically downloads all the binaries, all the metadata into a single folder for you. And then you take that folder and you serve that up over a web server. And that is what your VCF installer connects to. And those are the two ways in which you basically connect and pull down your required binaries. From that, you then go ahead and start going through the interactive wizard. And the nice thing about this wizard that, you go through it for the very first time to understand the different input, I can then export that as a JSON. And it gives you a couple of benefits. I can source control that configuration, but I can also repeat that deployment or make adjustments to do other types of deployments. And I can use that JSON directly in the UI. So it's not about just using it from an API standpoint, but it also just simplifies you going through the UI wizard. And then you automatically plug that in and auto-populates all the parameters. And of course, we then click next, start the deployment. The nice thing about the VCF installer is it goes through and fully validates. I can't even tell you how many times where I've actually fat fingered an IP address or missed a DNS entry and the VCF installer catches it. So as much as you're going to try to prepare in step one, the VCF installer does do a fantastic job to really validate that your infrastructure is ready to go and doesn't allow you to proceed until you've met all those requirements. Once the deployment's completed, it takes a couple of hours, depending on your infrastructure, your speed. You now have VCF9 up and running. Now, one of the things for what we've done is we've changed the eval licensing period. Historically, as many of you know, it's 60 days. it's now changed to 90 days. And what that means is it's important is that you do want to set up your licensing and VCF ops, and you do have 90 days as the components are running in evaluation mode, full set of capabilities, but you want to set up your entitlement with the Broadcom business portal to fill in the entitlements so that your infrastructure is fully licensed and you don't have to run into any issues with that. And then once you've done your deployment, you might want to do some additional day end operations. There are other VCF components like HCX, like VCF operations for Network Insight that you can now use the new fleet level manager to actually go and deploy these additional components. So there will be some additional day end. But that is the high level workflow for a brand new deployment of VCF 9. Pretty straightforward, right? So. And here's a quick screenshot, right, of the VCF installer. And you can kind of see the breakdown of the different components at the very end of the screen. I can not only download my JSON specification, I can also download this before I start the installer. I can review my passwords, and then you have a link directly to the new VCF operations console to start leveraging your private cloud. Okay, let's now jump to upgrading from your existing vSphere deployment. I'll go through sort of two scenarios. 2A is really upgrading just from a bare bones vSphere environment. I got my vCenter server, I got my ESX house, and I don't have any other components. We have a lot of customers still deploy that. So what does that look like? Obviously, we want to, again, design and plan and get those IPs, DNS, configuration, load it down there. We'll go ahead and then first upgrade that existing vCenter server that's going to be destined for that VCF management domain that I talked about, right? So you need to get to a certain version of 8.x. I believe it's 8.0U3, maybe Shri or Jared might correct me in there. And basically upgrade that using your traditional mechanisms, right? That might be in product upgrade through the VMware interface. That might be through an offline patch ISO. So how you upgrade vCenter, the VCSA today, you'll continue using the exact same mechanism and go and upgrade that to 9.0. Then you go and upgrade your ESXi host. Again, these set of hosts that will be destined for your management domain. Again, typically customers are using vSphere Lifecycle Manager. So you go and upgrade that through your traditional means and get them to 9.0. You'll then go ahead and deploy the VCF installer that we just talked about. And then you're going to configure the depot, get all the required binaries. Now, in this case here, because I've already upgraded my vCenter and ESX host, I don't need to download those binaries. So I'm only downloading the required components, such as VCF operations, the unified collector, NSX, etc. And then at this point, once it's completed that, it's going to then take this vCenter, this vSphere environment, and converge that into what we're calling a VCF instance. So the picture that I showed you earlier, you now have the remainder components that are automatically deployed for you. So again, the nice thing about the installer is it's able to detect what you've got today, fill in the details of the components that you need, and then kind of go through that process. And then again, you want to set up licensing. Now, again, I want to stress here that because you have an environment that was licensed using sort of perpetual licensing, when you get into 9.0, it automatically puts it into evaluation mode. So again, I said earlier, typically the evaluation period is 60 days. We've extended that to 90 days. So you have 90 days from the point of completing the upgrade to go set up your licensing. You certainly want to do that sooner rather than later, but that's something that you just want to be cognizant of is once you've completed that upgrade, those components will then be placed into that evaluation period. And then there's some additional things you might want to do as later fact. If I have additional vSphere environments that are running independently, now you can actually pull all of that in centrally into VCF operations. And so in the VCF operations UI, I now have the ability to import those existing disparate vSphere environments and bringing that in, automatically getting the benefits of all the fleet level capabilities I talked about. So now you have central visibility across all these different infrastructure, patch, upgrade, security, compliance, policy, password policy, everything that we had talked about earlier. And again, here's another screenshot of the VCF installer. It's really nice because it is interactive. So here, when I start up the deployment, the scenario that we talked about was just an existing vSphere environment, right? So I only have my vCenter server. So when I check that box, you can see the visual on the right-hand side said, yep, I've got my existing vCenter server. I got an existing vSphere cluster with some hosts. The things that are not with the existing, these are the components that I will be adding into the deployment. And again, the UI or the API will only prompt you for the required set of inputs, and then go ahead and automatically go through the full deployment without having to interact with the actual installer itself. So great experience there. Okay, the second upgrade path from an existing vSphere customer is someone who has vSphere as well as ARIA operations, right? Many of you have that deployed. So what does that scenario actually look like? A lot of it's going to look very similar, right? Design and plan. However, when we get to the ARIA component, we want to make sure that ARIA operation is running at a particular patch version, 8.18. And then you go ahead and upgrade that using the pack file. So it's just like how you upgrade ARIA operations today, you'll go ahead and upgrade that to the 9.0 version, right? So it's ready to go. And then I'll go and continue upgrading my vCenter server, my ESXi to 9.0. I'll then deploy the VCF installer, and then I'll go and configure the depot. And then at this point, once I've completed all that, it is now taking my vSphere environment and my ARIA operations, which is now VCF operations 9, and now converging that into my new VCF instance with all the remainder components. So now I have a full-fledged VCF 9 fleet ready to go. And again, similarly here, similar steps is we're going to go in and configure licensing as soon as you can. And then again, optionally, if you have additional vSphere environments, I can actually bring all of that in again by going through the import workload domain workflow. So as you can see here, pretty straightforward. And again, here's a screenshot here. If I have VCF operations or ARIA operations, I go and check that, and you can already imagine what that looks like for automation. If I have those components, I just simply check that, and then the installer is only going to deploy the components I require. And that also means that for binaries that I already have, you don't need to go and repeat that download process. So really great experience compared to earlier releases of VCF 5.x, where I always had the binaries regardless if you're using them or not. Okay, so what does a VCF upgrade look like? So if this is for customers who are already running VCF, maybe you're running VCF 3.x, 4.x, hopefully not, but you need to get to VCF 5.2, if I recall correctly, and maybe Jared or Shri will comment on the specific versions, and then you get to 9.0. And that's actually pretty straightforward to the existing VCF experience. So let's take a look at what that looks like. First off, we're going to log into our infrastructure, and we're going to upgrade the ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager. This is now referred to as the VCF Operations Fleet Manager, but it's basically our VRLCM, our ARIA LCM, depending on what name and terminology you're familiar with, and get that to the latest 9.0 version. Once we have that, we can then use that as a way to upgrade our ARIA Operations component to 9.0. So very similar to what we saw earlier. And then, since I already have VCF running, I also have the SCDC Manager component. I can now go and pull for the latest version of SCDC Manager binary. So that way it's got all of that goodness in terms of what comes with VCF 9.0. And once I go in and upgrade the SCDC Manager component within my VCF 5.x environment to 9.0, I'm then able to use its native interface to automatically download all of the required binaries. So things like NSX, vCenter, and ENSX. And for existing VCF customers, this is something that you're already familiar with, right? This workflow does not change from what you're already doing today with any other patch and update, right? So you go and pull those binaries down there. And then there's a automatic workflow that you go through and upgrade the different components. We start with NSX Manager to get it to 9.0. We upgrade vCenter to get it to 9.0. And then we also want to converge our existing update manager. If you're still using vSphere Update Manager or VUM, this is going to be a prerequisite. So there is some automation built into the VCF workflow to go in and take these vSphere clusters that we're using patch baseline and convert them into a VLCM image for you automatically. And then you go ahead and the last step is to upgrade your remainder ESXi host. And now you go from an existing VCF environment to now a fully deployed VCF 9 infrastructure. So again, pretty straightforward. A lot of these steps are existing experience that you already have. And here's a quick screenshot of the SCDC Manager UI. And as you can see, once you've updated to the latest 9.0 version, you'll see some of the changes in the UI. And you'll go through the same process as you typically go through and patch and upgrade. You got to pull down the binaries, go through the pre-checks run list, and then you can kind of go configure the update or schedule it as you see fit and kind of go proceed with that. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. So I want to cover a couple of key takeaways here, right? First one is really just understanding some of these new 9.0 constructs and the concepts that is included in 9.0. Now, while some of this might sound familiar, there are some architectural changes. We talked a little about the implications of VCF operation as it pertains to 9. Certainly a lot of the benefits from a fleet level standpoint. We've also been working with a lot of customers to take a look at where are their current deployments today? How do we help them get to a 9.0 environment and as seamlessly as possible using the components that they've got? And we've done that by creating these common design blueprints or VCF design blueprints that you can find directly in the Broadcom support portal. So no longer do you have to go elsewhere to find that. So take a look at some of those things, familiarize yourself and figure out what are the requirements that you have from an availability standpoint. And again, knowing that these designs are flexible, You can start small, grow into any of these designs. I can transition from one design to another, and I can also mix and match, right? And we certainly will have more blueprints in the future that talks about different types of architecture and different types of application scenarios. So again, if you have feedback, certainly we welcome that. Second one is around it's easy to get started. Again, taking that fundamental building block of that VCF basic design, that becomes that foundational building block, right? And so if you're just getting started, take a look at that, and then you can easily mix and match those designs based on your specific needs and your business requirements. And then also, there is an upgrade path for all of you out there, right? One of the things that we spend a lot of time with both product engineering team is really looking at what do our customers have to play today? We know that customers have different components, different versions over the years, and we want to make it as seamless as possible. So there's a lot of great upgrade content. In fact, some of this is written by folks on this call here in terms of how do you go from a particular configuration of components and products to ultimately the full VCF9 stack. So there are prescriptive guidance out there. So take a look at the upgrade documentation. And again, knowing that there is an upgrade path for you. And we even have some sessions at Explore to go talk about some of these designs. So if you're tending to explore, highly recommend you check out some of those things where you're able to talk to us about your particular design and what are some of the best practices, things that you might recommend. Maybe you want to change the way that you're architecting your solution to better fit some of the application needs. And in fact, some of you talked all about Explore. There's a lot of great content at Explore, but I do want to highlight a brand new VCF9 Design and Architect series that our team have put together. So these are just some of the sessions that are available. I believe most of these are already listed on the content catalog. There may be a few more. And so if you're interested in understanding some of the best practices for deploying a brand new VCF9 deployment, upgrading, maybe you're designing for edge computing, maybe you're designing for modern applications, or you just want to operate at scale, leveraging all the goodness that comes with VCF9, definitely make a note of these sessions and certainly welcome you to register at Explore, and I hope to see you there. So with that, I want to really thank you very much for your time. Hopefully you guys had a good session and enjoy the rest of your webinar. Thank you very much for your time.